My name's Harriet Ellen LeSueur Warner. I was born on June 18, 1850 in St. Heliers, Jersey. My older sisters have told you how our family joined the church and got to Utah. I was only 5 then, so I don't remember much about it, except that I got lost when we first arrived in America. My parents were frantic, but found me at the police station enjoying my first ice cream. Our LeSueur ancestors resided in Jersey for many generations. Some believe they came from Normandy in the mid-16th century when Protestants called Huguenots were being persecuted and left France in droves. The Canadian LeSueurs traced their roots to the Huguenots who fled from Normandy to the Netherlands. It may be no coincidence that we can't trace our LeSueur ancestors in Jersey beyond the mid-1500s. That's when the Huguenots came to Jersey. When our family arrived in Utah, we first lived in West Bountiful. You call it Woods Cross today. The snow, mountains, and most of our neighbors were new to us, but it didn't take long for us to become familiar with them. Less than a year after we arrived, my oldest sister married James Fackrell. I remember it well because it was the day before my 6th birthday. I didn't know then, but Ma was pregnant at the time. My brother Will was born 5 months later, in November. Father planted crops on a rented farm and worked for others. Within 2 years, he bought a small parcel of land and was building a house when he decided to move south with his brother-in-law, Philip Marette. I'm not sure why or exactly when he decided to move south. It may have been in the spring of 1858, when President Young announced that all the Mormon settlements in northern Utah be abandoned and prepare for burning because of the approach of Johnston's army. Nearly 30,000 of us moved south to Provo and other Utah towns. My father traded our farm, an unfinished house, for a yoke of oxen and a wagon, and we moved to American Fork. Johnston's army marched through deserted Salt Lake City in June and made their camp 20 miles west of American Fork. We were surprised, but glad the so-called Utah War was over. Some called it Buchanan's blunder, but in a way, it was a blessing. My dad and Uncle Philip made good wages working for the government, building houses. In the summer of 1859, Mary Ann and James Fackrell visited and convinced my parents to return to Bountiful. James offered to sell them a 30-acre farm with a log house. We moved back and were happy to be in a home we could call our own. Jane, Caroline, John, and I attended school in Bountiful, where we lived for almost 5 years. When Jane was 17, she married John Davis, a good man who quickly won our hearts. When Pa died in 1862, it was a shock. There were 6 of us living in our home with no breadwinner. I was 12 years old. My mother was wise and could do almost any kind of work. She knitted pretty lace window curtains and pillow slips. She could knit a spool of thread in one day. She taught the girls how to sew and knit, skills that served me well when I had a family of my own. The boys herded our cows to pasture along with some of our neighbors who paid them for the service. We lived in our home, rented out the farm, and sold milk and eggs. Ma Tante cared for our small garden. She only spoke French, so we had to hold on to our French until she died. The Fackrells and Davises helped us when they could. Under Mom's leadership, we not only survived, but continued to prosper. In 1864, John and Jane Davis moved to Bear Lake Valley in Idaho. Mom visited them and decided we should move also. The following year, we sold the farm for $600, gave hugs and kisses to the Fackrells, and moved to Montpelier. We were only there 2 years when my sister Caroline and James Charles married Charles Mallory. She was 18. A year after Caroline married, I went to fetch some water on a warm summer day. On the way home, I had my shoes off when a young man approached. I was wearing a sunbonnet and a long dress, but felt uncovered because my feet were showing. I got as short as possible making my dress cover my feet. He called me a little girl and asked if I would like him to carry my 2 buckets of water. When we arrived at the gate, he discovered I was not a little girl, which began a romance that led us to marry in July 1867. I was 17 and Charles was 27. Please don't confuse my husband, Charles Warner, with my brother-in-law, Charles Mallory. In 2 years, my mother added 2 sons to her family, both named Charles. Our 4 families worked together, the 3 sons-in-law teaching John and William the right way to work. My first 4 children died in their early years. Of the 6 who lived, Alvin and Mary Jane were born in Montpelier, Perhillion was born in St. John's, Sylvia and Darius in Safford, and Pearl was born in Oregon, New Mexico. After 10 years in Montpelier, Charles and Caroline Mallory moved to Provo. They stayed there for a year before going with the first pioneer group to Mesa, Arizona, arriving on January 16, 1878. They reported that one of my nephews went swimming the day after they arrived, which was his birthday. By this time, John and Will had married. It wasn't long before the 2 LeSueur families and the Davises decided to join a group going to Mesa from Montpelier. Unfortunately, 3 months before we left, my sister Caroline Mallory died after giving birth to a baby who also died. Her husband was now a single parent with 5 young children. There is a story that my husband and I raised 2 of Caroline's children, but that's not entirely correct. The Mallorys lived in Tempe and Mesa for a couple of years before moving to St. John's, where Charles worked as a carpenter and homesteaded. Eventually, they moved to Utah. One son, Warren, stayed in St. John's, where he later married Anna Freeman and had 4 children. He worked in the St. John's pharmacy before moving to Shelley, Idaho. The other 4 Mallory children grew up in Utah. So after a journey of 3 months and 8 days, we arrived in Mesa on January 17, 1879. There were about 50 people in our party. A few were from Salt Lake City, but most were from Montpelier. We crossed the Colorado River at Lee's Ferry and went on to Brigham City, known today as Winslow. From there, we went to Camp Verde, and then Jonesville, or Lehigh, as you know it today. We only stayed in Mesa for a year. Then we moved to St. John's with the LeSueurs and Davises. In 1883, we moved to Layton. I think it's called Safford today. I was pregnant with my 8th child and worried I wouldn't have a woman's help when the time came. Luckily, we found the Hiram Tippett's family who had camped nearby. How glad both of us women were to see each other. Sister Tippett's was also expecting a baby soon, and we agreed to care for each other, hoping it would not be at the same time. I had my baby 2 weeks before Sister Tippett's. As far as we knew, Sylvia was the first white child born in that part of the Gila Valley. I became a midwife and brought 42 babies into the world. I comforted those who were ill in the early settlements of the Arizona Territory, especially when there were Indians on the warpath and they couldn't travel to see a doctor. I was also a tailor, and people claimed I was exceptionally skillful with a needle, making men's suits and wedding and burial clothing. I also wove carpets and rugs and made hairpieces from human hair. Some say that my wigs could compare with today's. I was in constant demand to sew for others. When I would sit down to rest, I had to be knitting or have something to keep my hands busy. My motto was, if you want to be happy, keep busy. Even though I stayed busy, I always found time for church work. I was the president of the primary for 25 years and worked for many years in the Relief Society. I had a great concern for gathering the names of my kindred dead and doing their temple work. During my last 7 years, I lived near the Mesa Temple and attended most every day it was open. My nephew, James W. LeSueur, did much to help me, and I appreciated him for it. I told my granddaughter that when I died, I wanted to have all my laundry and house cleaning done and be freshly bathed and dressed, ready to go to church. On Sunday morning, May 7th, 1933, I was dressed for Sunday school and sat in my rocker by my bed where I could see when my ride came. I opened my lesson book and was reading my Sunday school lessons when the Lord called me home. I was 82 years old, and it was just as I wanted it. James W. LeSueur stated at my funeral that I had done the temple work for 5,000 people. I was honored when he also said, "Few people live such a good and noble life as Harriet Ellen LeSueur Warner."